Okay, I have a journalist with me today that I have been following that expertly covers conservative stories, big stories like the January 6th pipe bomb that's being ignored by the media, the Biden collusion, trying to get Donald Trump every way they can. Julie Kelly, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, Stephen, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
So I wanted to jump right into a question. We were supposed to speak yesterday, and you had to
Mhm.
cancel because you and your team were watching for Donald Trump immunity court information to come out. Could you give us an update on what you were looking for and what's going on with those immunity cases?
Yeah, so thank you and your team for your flexibility. I really appreciate it because with all of the goings on with Donald Trump's four trials, you never know what's going to happen. But yesterday was a big day because we were waiting. Donald Trump had a deadline as of yesterday to file an emergency application stay, which means a hold of the DC appellate court ruling that was handed down last week that helps the process along to ultimately deny his claims of presidential immunity from criminal prosecution. So this is an order that originated with Judge Tanya Chutkin in December, the district court judge in DC who denied his motion to dismiss. That then was kicked to the DC appellate court circuit court. They moved on that on an expedited schedule, held oral arguments on January 9th, and 30 days later, not the normal 4 or 5 month stretch, Stephen, that happens in appellate court decisions, they handed down a 3-0 decision to uphold Judge Chutkin's order denying his immunity claims. That now is before the Supreme Court. The court answered today, actually, Chief Justice John Roberts now giving Jack Smith until next week to file his response to Donald Trump's application for this stay or hold on the immunity order.
Okay. Now, how dangerous is it to remove immunity from a sitting president or a past president? Because I'd have to imagine someone could get in and immediately go after George W. Bush for the Middle East. They
Mhm.
could go after Obama for Syria and droning, bombing. They could go after Donald Trump. We could even go after Joe Biden.
Right.
How dangerous is this? And do we need a leader who has the ability to take risks, especially when defending the country? What are your thoughts on the immunity clause?
I mean, this is one of the arguments that Donald Trump's lawyers is making, and that is that this is going to produce or begin a slippery slope. This descent into a banana republic style climate, quite frankly, I think we're pretty much there. But if a president, former president, is not shielded from criminal prosecution from his successor, especially successor of the opposite party, this is just going to perpetuate a nonstop cycle of, of sitting president using his resources, his power, especially at the Department of Justice, to investigate an armed FBI raid like we saw happen to Donald Trump in August of 2022, open multiple criminal investigations. Of course, Jack Smith has indicted Donald Trump on two matters, January 6th and classified documents, and force that person, that individual, the former president, especially if he's going to be your prospective opponent in the next general election, which of course Donald Trump is, that this will just perpetuate this cycle. Now, Stephen, what I found, and there were many, I think, weak or a lot of flaws in both the original opinion and the appellate court decision. The fact that these judges, and keep in mind, out of the four judges who've decided this, three of them were appointed by either Barack Obama or Joe Biden. They're Democrat appointed judges.
Okay.
Is there downplaying of this risk that you're talking about? If Donald Trump wins the presidency at the end of this year, all he has to do is look at the Robert Hur report, the special counsel report into Joe Biden's illegal handling of classified documents. And as soon as he's sworn into office, get his acting AG and then his attorney general, hand him that Hur report, a few other things from the Biden family corruption racket, and have them investigate Joe Biden, his family, his associates, and everyone else, like Donald Trump and his family and his associates have been subjected to. So the judges in this case really didn't give that a lot of consideration. They downplayed it, said that there's no evidence this would happen. Well, of course there is. So this is just one of the issues that the Supreme Court will have to consider if they do take up this case.
Okay. Do you think that George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden are being silent on this because they want to get Trump out? Or is it the fact that none of those three are going to run for office ever again, and so they don't really care what happens in the future? Is this whole thing just around getting Trump, and then they know future presidents won't really have to, we'll give those other guys immunity, but Donald J. Trump, we've got to get this guy?
Well, I mean, I don't think George W. Bush or Barack Obama are afraid that if Donald Trump wins, that he would use his DOJ in that way. I don't even know what the statute of limitations would be in, say, the drone strike, or George W. Bush intentionally misleading the country into war, which is something that Donald Trump's lawyers raised in their motions and their briefs in the immunity matter. So I don't think they're worried about it. And it was interesting because the appellate court kind of said, well, we're just talking about this certain case. Well, the Supreme Court doesn't roll that way, right? They're not going to do a carve out. Yes, presidents are immune from criminal prosecution unless your last name rhymes with rump. Like that's not how the Supreme Court is going to roll on this. So there's not going to be a carve out for Donald Trump. I don't think those former presidents are worried, but maybe in the back of Joe Biden's head, in light of Robert Hur's 388-page report that detailed not only his handling of classified documents, his knowledge that he had classified documents, the recklessness with which he handled and stored those files, and also evidence that his own ghostwriter deleted recordings that he had with Joe Biden where he admitted that he had classified records dating back to 2017. So, this could backfire on Joe Biden and future presidents. But this is not a settled issue. And you see a lot of legal experts out there saying, well, this is a no-brainer. Of course, the president should be subjected to criminal prosecution. Well, this has never been done before because, Stephen, as you know, no former president has ever been charged in a criminal prosecution before. So we'll see what the Supreme Court does. We should know quickly how they rule on the emergency stay. If they don't authorize the stay on the appellate court ruling, then the trial in Washington that has been on hold pending the resolution of the immunity matter, that gets restarted. So that could lead to more pretrial activity, jury selection, and setting a new date in the Washington January 6th trial against Donald Trump.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for keeping up to date on all of that. You're absolutely right. The Supreme Court does not play the same games that these lower courts play. I mean, just look at the Colorado situation. I mean, right out of the gate, all 9 justices were basically like, who is Colorado to decide who the president gets to be? It's a one person, one vote over all 50 states. The people get to decide. We, the people, decide who is Colorado to be able to do this. And then in terms of, is Donald Trump this awful Nazi Hitler-like leader that led an insurrection against the federal government with a couple hundred unarmed people that he didn't know what they were going to do? And half of the justices were like, how do you prove that he committed insurrection? Like they couldn't even come to a common definition of what an insurrection was. And then there's been absolutely no connection between Donald Trump and these groups that made the decision to attack or behave badly that day. So I agree with you. I think the Supreme Court behaves very differently than these lower courts.
They absolutely will. I mean, Judge Chutkan's ruling, and of course, she is an Obama appointee. She has been extremely harsh on January 6th defendants in her courtroom, sending even those convicted or taking plea deals on low-level petty offenses, sending them to jail. She has compared January 6th to the Boston Marathon bombing. She's compared it to the Oklahoma City bombing. So these are the political views of Democrat appointed judges who have made this really historic a decision with dire consequences for the future of the country. So the Supreme Court could do a number of things at this point, Stephen. So first, they will have to rule on the application to continue to hold the pretrial proceedings in Washington for the January 6th trial. Then they will have to set a deadline for Donald Trump to file a petition for a writ of cert, which is asking the court to accept briefs where they will consider reversing the appellate court's decision. And that timeline will be established by the court as well. Now, if the court comes back and number one rejects this application for a stay, you need 5 out of 9 justices to approve an emergency stay on an appellate court ruling. There's a chance that they may not get 5 justices, which would automatically lift this temporary hold. Will they accept a petition for a writ of cert where he will then make his case as to why the appellate court ruling was wrong? Hard to see where they don't. And the biggest reason why the court probably will take up this petition for the writ of cert and hear the case eventually is because Jack Smith himself has already asked the Supreme Court to weigh in on this matter. Recall that he asked the Supreme Court, he took the rare step and asked the court to consider the immunity issue and bypass the appellate court. The Supreme Court denied that, but you already have Jack Smith, the special counsel, on record asking the Supreme Court to consider this issue. So it's going to be hard for him to backtrack and say, oh, never mind, I didn't mean that. You shouldn't consider this appellate court ruling. So, but a lot of things are going to be unfolding at the Supreme Court. Of course, to your point, the oral arguments that were heard last week in the Colorado case, it was very clear that all 9 justices had severe concerns as to how Colorado handled that quote unquote 5-day trial and the unprecedented nature of a state unilaterally deciding to kick a national candidate off the ballot based on something in the Constitution. So it seemed pretty clear that they're going to reverse Colorado. How they handle the immunity issue, that will be not as clear cut as what we have seen and heard in the Colorado matter.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go back to the special counsel Robert Hur situation. Help me just quickly. Was he assigned by Merrick Garland specifically to the Biden case?
He was. So when Joe Biden's team and general counsel admitted a few days before the election in 2022 that, oh, gee, we found some classified records at the Penn Biden Center in Washington. Then they found documents at his residence in Delaware, numerous locations, actually at his home in Delaware. Then in January of 2023, Merrick Garland appointed Robert Hur, U.S. attorney, to be the special counsel. And so he took up that investigation, lasted a year, and then resulted in this report that was issued last week. I have an article on my Substack, Declassified with Julie Kelly, where I lay out how what Robert Hur accounted for in his report represents a far more egregious case of mishandling classified documents than what we see in the pending criminal indictment against Donald Trump. Joe Biden was trained on how to handle classified documents as a vice president. He had a history, according to witnesses who told Robert Hur this, he had a history of mishandling and even apparently misplacing high-level top secret government material in his possession. They had to give him a special briefing in 2010 to remind him that he could not take these classified briefing books and other papers with him, but he continued to do so. So he has a history and a knowledge of how this was supposed to be handled. Then he told his ghostwriter, apparently in 2017, that he had found all these classified files in his basement at a home he was renting in Virginia. Those papers were then transported to his home in Delaware in 2019. So he had classified files all over the place. But unlike Donald Trump, who had FBI agents raid his house for 9 hours and steal 13,000 pieces of mostly personal property out of his home, Joe Biden was allowed to do this on his own timeline with his own aides for months, was not subjected to a subpoena, was not subjected to a raid, of course, turned over some classified documents. Can only imagine that some were possibly destroyed, concealed, because we don't have any tracking of the aides who were involved in removing files from the Penn Biden Center, or possibly his own home in Delaware. So my guess is he had a lot more than what Robert Hur was told or was able to investigate. But here, Joe Biden, not prosecuted, his ghostwriter who deleted evidence, not prosecuted. He gets a 388-page report. Donald Trump is spending time and money in a Florida courtroom trying to defend himself against a far less egregious case of classified documents mishandling than Joe Biden.
Wow. Okay. Oh my gosh. This is why I wanted to have you on. You understand this. You have the history, all the receipts. I love it. But the reason that I ask if he was assigned by Merrick Garland is didn't they task him with finding the truth? And now they're mad that he's told the truth, that we have a weak, slow, difficult memoried person that can't, that he's so addled with his memory and his abilities that he can't even go in front of a jury or to be questioned in a courtroom. And yet he gets to remain the sitting president of the most powerful country in the world. Like, didn't they hire Robert Hur to tell us the truth?
Well, look, it's settled law that a sitting president cannot be criminally prosecuted. So that's really all Robert Hur had to say. But he did go into some explanation, I think, to justify his own reasoning, in addition to the fact that a sitting president can't be criminally prosecuted, is that Joe Biden just does not have the mental faculties to stand trial, that a jury, especially one in Washington, D.C., or even Delaware, would feel sympathy for Joe Biden. And then, of course, explained or disclosed how Joe Biden could not remember the year or within several years of when his son Beau passed away, or even when he was vice president and when his term ended. So that, of course, is what the media has seized on, and Democrats, and of course, Joe Biden himself, Jill Biden, expressing outrage that Robert Hur disclosed this in the report. But look, he kind of had to have more reasoning than just I can't prosecute a sitting president, because we're dealing with all this unprecedented legal territory when it comes to Donald Trump. So maybe it's time to revisit that. That would be the argument, I'm sure, from Donald Trump and the right. So they've really focused in on Robert Hur's, revelations there. But the more damning part of Robert Hur's report is Joe Biden's flagrant, willful, and knowledgeable mishandling and storing and retaining classified materials in numerous locations. And at one point, it seemed like he did not want to turn over some of his notebooks that he had kept from his vice presidency that had classified papers in them. So there was a little bit of what Jack Smith might call obstruction of justice, obstruction of an investigation. So, but that's another thing that Joe Biden will not face charges for, at least for now.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay. I know we have limited time. You've got lots of other interviews going on. You've written a book called January 6th, How Democrats Used the Capitol Protest to Launch a War on Terror Against the Political Right. As you've researched January 6th, do you see any kind of narrative that people are being set up, that they are being overly criminalized by the justice system? I mean, they treat these people like this is the Nuremberg trial versus the fact that a lot of the people that they've arrested, humiliated, gotten fired, had millions of dollars in legal fees, literally it ended up in like a misdemeanor for being on the wrong part of the sidewalk at the Capitol. Like, as you investigated this, what are some of the things that stood out that you've put in the book?
Oh, geez, there's so much, Stephen. And, that book was published 2 years ago, believe it or not. So I wrote it as I started covering January 6th, right from the beginning, listening to the court proceedings where people were denied release, even though they were veterans with no criminal record, and they were accused of nonviolent crimes like conspiracy. And these judges in Washington were denying them release, refusing to set bond or any conditions of release because they were involved in the insurrection. So I was really horrified at what I was hearing from the very beginning. But now fast forward, to your point, we have now more than 1,300 Americans who have been criminally charged for their involvement in January 6th. The DOJ and FBI announces new arrests almost every day. They are continuing to round up people involved in January 6th. And people's lives have been utterly destroyed. The DOJ has weaponized statutes like obstruction of an official proceeding. By the way, their misuse, their abuse of that statute is now pending before the Supreme Court. And there's a very good chance, and this is really important, and I've done a ton of research writing at my Substack and Real Clear Investigations people can check out, because the Supreme Court very well could reverse the most common felony associated with January 6th prosecution, which is 1512C2 obstruction of an official proceeding. If they do, not only, Stephen, will this represent an indelible black mark, as it should, on more than 15 federal judges in Washington, D.C., including appellate court judges who upheld this, but every prosecutor, D.C. U.S. Attorney Matthew Graves, and every line prosecutor who forced this felony on hundreds of J6ers. And it also represents half the case against Donald Trump, by the way. So this is another thing that people should be watching for. But that's just one example of how the DOJ has abused the law with the consent of DC federal judges of both parties, by the way, to criminalize political dissent, call these people domestic terrorists, and treat them as such. So I write a little bit about that in my book, but I've got a more updated coverage on my Substack at Declassified with Julie Kelly. If people want to really see what's happening to these people, what has happened to them, and what continues to happen to them.
Well, I'm gonna put a link down to that below. Okay, final question. I appreciate all the research that you and your team does. Do you? I'm not a brilliant researcher like you, especially with the legal stuff. But just as an outsider guy on social media, I'm seeing what seems like a lot of collusion between Fani Willis and White House lawyers, Fani Willis and the J6 committee. I witnessed with the Florida situation with Trump, Jack Smith moves people from DC down in order to get the grand jury conviction in Florida. Is there collusion going on between the White House, the Department of Justice, and the lawyers that are actually trying to get criminal proceedings?
So there is evidence that Joe Biden's general counsel has been working with Fani Willis and her team. There is evidence that Nathan Wade, one of her prosecutors and now apparent boyfriend, has visited the Biden White House, I believe, on 2 different occasions. The prosecution team had to disclose to the judge last month in a hearing for one of the defendants in the Georgia RICO indictment that Fani Willis's office received 2 letters from Joe Biden's general counsel. Now, what could that possibly be about? Well, the judge wanted to see it. He saw the letters, and now this judge has kept them under seal. So maybe at some point we'll be able to see those letters. But there is definite evidence of collusion between Joe Biden's general counsel. We also saw evidence of this in the classified documents case. Donald Trump's lawyer have produced evidence that that Archives was working with someone from the general counsel's office of Joe Biden's White House on setting up a documents charge. This is even before Donald Trump turned over these boxes to the Archives in January of 2022. This dates back to May of 2021. So there's no doubt, as anyone would expect, that Joe Biden and his lawyers, White House lawyers, closely working with the DOJ and other prosecutors to set up and prosecute and hopefully convict, in their eyes, Donald Trump.
Wow, wow, wow. Okay. I'm going to put a link to your Substack. Thank you so much. You guys, if you're liking this, make sure to give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, go check out Julie's Substack. And Julie, I know you're busy, you got to run. Thank you so much for coming on. And we'll have you back on again to keep us updated on this, because there's just so much information coming out. Most of us, we can't keep up with it. We don't fully understand it. So thank you for having a brilliant mind that can condense everything and summarize it for us. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me on. Hope to be